Good morning. My
Good
name
morning.
is Reverend Zamoria Brandon. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I want to thank Reverend Abby for inviting me to offer this reading this morning. The title is The Birth of a New Age by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from 1956. And he says, "We stand today between two worlds, the dying old and the emerging new. I am aware of the fact that there are those who would argue that we live in the most ghastly period of human history. They would argue that we are going backwards instead of forward, that we are retrogressing instead of progressing. But far from representing retrogression or tragic hopelessness, the present tension represents the necessary pains that accompany the birth of anything new. It is both historically and biologically true that there can be no birth or growth without birth and growing pains. Wherever there is the emergence of the new and the fading of the old, that is historically true, and so the tensions which we witness in the world today are indicative of the fact that a new world is being born and an old world is passing away. I would like to suggest some things that we must do to live in this new world, to prepare to live in it, the challenges that confront us. The first thing is this, that we must rise above the narrow confines of our individualistic concerns, with a broader concern for all humanity. You see, this new world is a world of geographical togetherness. No individual can afford to live alone now. The nation cannot live alone, for we have been brought together. This has been done certainly by modern man with great scientific insight. I have talked a great deal about the coming new age, about this age that is passing away, and about this age that is coming into being. There is a danger that after listening to that, you will become the victims of an optimism covered with superficiality. Any optimism which says in substance, we can sit down now and do nothing because this new age is inevitable. We can sit down and wait for the rolling in of the wheels of inevitability. We don't need to do anything. It's coming anyway. We cannot be complacent. We cannot sit idly by and wait for the coming of the inevitable. I would argue not to take that attitude, for it might be true that this new age is inevitable, but we can speed it up, the coming of the new age. It might be true that old man segregation is on his deathbed, but history has proven that social systems have a great last minute of breathing power. I'm going to say that again. It might be true that old man segregation is on his deathbed, but history has proven that social systems have a great last-minute breathing power. Amen, Ashe, and so it is.
Thank you, Reverend. Oh, my friends, what a week. As I was leaving newcomer sessions after church last Sunday, I noticed several of you, many of you, a flood of you maybe, texting me with news of the 76ers' decision to abandon the plan for the Chinatown Arena. This congregation, and some of you know this and some of you don't, so I'm going to give just the simple background. This congregation, alongside others in our Interfaith Justice Coalition, POWER, and a broad Save Chinatown coalition, have been working now for a couple of years to halt this plan, which would have decimated our historic Chinatown community, caused enormous traffic congestion that could hinder life-saving access to the medical facilities in downtown, and was opposed by something like 70% of this city, alongside offering only very little meaningful economic development and other benefits for our community. Just weeks ago, most of City Council voted to move forward with the plan. And though we and others vowed to continue our opposition, most of us believed that that fight had been essentially lost. After more than a year of organizing meetings and protests, what an enormous win for justice. And then later this week, the news lit up again, this time with a ceasefire deal for Gaza. What looks like it could be a lasting end to over 15 months of destruction and bloodshed and massive humanitarian crisis, which has taken over 46,000 lives of Palestinian people and over 1,200 lives of Israeli people. Whether you call what has happened in Gaza a war or a genocide, we who believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, who believe that we must respect the interdependent web of life of which we are all a part, we who want no one in any nation to die of violence, who do not want our tax dollars spent on sending bombs overseas to murder thousands of children, have great reason to celebrate. After more than a year of organizing and meetings and protests, what an enormous win for justice. What a week. And still, the wildfires burn, only partially contained even now. Evidence of environmentally unsustainable development and rampant climate change. And tomorrow there will be a presidential inauguration followed within hours, maybe within minutes, by promises to begin mass deportations and to pardon those convicted from the U.S. Capitol attack on January 6th, and to sign executive orders to further weaken environmental protections and bodily autonomy and public health and integrity among education, among other things. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose legacy we celebrate this weekend on what would have been the 96th anniversary, well, it is the 96th anniversary of his birth. He would be 96 years old if he lived today. Spoke both in his speech to a national gathering of Unitarian Universalists back in 1966, and in his historic I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington in 1963, about what he called the jangling discords of our nation. In speaking about his hope and his belief in our ability to overcome the massive injustices facing our people, he proclaimed, "We will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood." Or maybe today we would say siblinghood. Jangling discords. My friends, I admit that this has been a week of me feeling those jangling discords pretty strongly, even amidst the enormous reasons for us to celebrate. The word jangling, in a literal sense, means to make a metallic ringing sound that's typically a discordant ringing sound, like the ringing of a loud bell that makes you go like, because it's too loud and it's slightly off key. It's not the joyful peal of a wedding bell or the solemn, mournful toll of a funeral bell. It's a loud clanging that sets you on edge. And when it's used in the Bible, at least in the King James Version of the Bible, jangling means foolish, empty talk. People who talk and do nothing. People whose words are laced with hypocrisy are jangling. To me, it's been also feeling like trying to somehow hold all of it together, the celebration and the grief, the rage, the fury, and the joy, America the beautiful, and United States the oppressive. I will admit that it's hard for me to hold on to that faith that Dr. King had, that it's still possible to transform the reality of this country and this world, which often feels like a dystopia to me, into a beautiful symphony of siblinghood. In the final years before his assassination at the age of 39, Dr. King often spoke about what he called the three evils, or the giant triplets. And thank you, Reverend Zamoria, for reminding me that this maybe should be what the sermon is today. Racism, extreme materialism, or he sometimes simply just called that one poverty, and militarism. Racism, poverty, or materialism, and militarism. It's part of what was so radical about his message then, and remains radical now, is that the work of justice is not just about racism, and perhaps if he was talking today, he might be talking about some other identity-based oppressions as well, but he was mostly talking about racism. But also the critique of the evils within our capitalist system and the massive wealth disparity it creates amongst and across racial identities. And also the military-industrial complex to which our country devotes so much of our resources. Part of what makes it hard for me to hold on to a faith that a beautiful symphony of siblinghood is possible is that these three evils seem to me to be as much on display today as they were in his time nearly 60 years ago. One need only listen to the rhetoric of our soon-to-be president and his allies about immigration in this country to hear the giant triplet of racism, right? One need only look at the vast disparities across racial lines around wealth, employment numbers, imprisonment, home ownership, educational outcomes, health outcomes, and life expectancy. Because in all of these areas, Black and Indigenous people in particular, and in many cases all people of color, are statistically much worse off than white people in our country, even today, even 60 years after he spoke those words. And though national figures like President Biden have been increasingly calling out the dangers of what we are seeing in the United States of a wealth-based oligarchy, and those of you who haven't been spending time with the definition of oligarchy recently, which is me, oligarchy is a ruling of the many by the few. And in this case, it's a ruling of the many middle class and working class and poor people by the few extremely wealthy people. One need not look even at that story nationally, but only in the story in our city to see that truth. The plan for the 76ers arena in Chinatown itself was, to me, an example of this giant evil triplet, a plan formed by 3 billionaire developers and pushed through city council despite widespread organizing and opposition, until the developers then simply seemed to change their minds and instead go back to their other idea of a new arena in South Philly, where our other major sports arenas are. Or so I've been told. I've literally never been to a game down there. So if anyone's got a season pass and wants to hook me up sometime, I'm happy to go, and I will try to root for the correct team. I am not good with sports. Many other fine qualities, but not good with sports. People, this is not to say I like any shade on the 76ers, go 76ers. People are still trying to make sense of what happened last week, though, right? Are some of you trying to make sense of what happened with the arena last week? Yes. And why it happened? Because almost nobody saw it coming. And while the story is complex, and by talking about the arena, I by no means mean to vilify everyone who supported the arena, because it wasn't without its benefits. It's just for our congregation and for many other communities, the costs vastly outweighed the benefits. It's not that it didn't have benefits, but what's been sitting with me since that news came out is that even city council and the mayor were blindsided. Even the city council members who voted for the plan and the mayor were blindsided. Several of them spoke publicly about their anger at feeling, quote, played like a pawn by the arena developers. Those same developers that they were happy to follow the wishes of against the majority of their constituents. And I see the stopping of the arena as a win for justice. I think it is. But I don't know how much it really was a win for our movement. Does that make sense? In other words, I'm so glad the Center City Arena will not be built. But the bad taste that it leaves in my mouth is that even supporters of the arena feel manipulated by the ultra-wealthy, who seemed to make their stunning reversal without regard to anyone, whether the people's movement who opposed them or even the elected officials who supported them. The Center City Arena won't be built, but the giant evil triplet of extreme materialism still emerged as the winner to me in this story. The arena story is the big one in our city right now. But the same dynamic is playing out in small ways across all of our neighborhoods as developers are buying up properties and making it harder for residents to achieve or maintain their home ownership. It's hastening gentrification, it's degrading the fabric of our neighborhoods. This is the reason that Power is working on the issues of housing and development. And again, I encourage you to take part in that session next Sunday if you want to work towards building a positive justice in the city rather than just working to stop the injustices that keep being thrown our way. Dr. King said to that gathering of Unitarian Universalists back in 1966, quote, "It may be that we spend too much of our national budget establishing military bases around the world, and too little on bases of genuine concern and understanding." He went on, "All I'm saying is this, that all of life is interrelated, and somehow we are all tied together. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I am ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of all reality." Every night, for the past 15 plus months, I have sat in my children's bedroom, nursing my baby, Robin, to sleep. And every night I bundle her up in her little sleepy sack and I cradle her in my arms and I turn out the lights and I turn on a soft Chopin nocturne to help lull her to sleep alongside the milk she gets from my body. And every night, with the lights out and my baby in my arms, my mind has drifted to the other mothers around the world who are nursing their babies to sleep. These mothers and babies who are, I know, tied to me as strongly as I am tied to my own nursing baby. In these past 15 months, I have thought about the mothers in Gaza especially, the mothers who had to leave their homes, their safe homes, like my safe home, for temporary shelters, sometimes many different temporary shelters over that time. I think about the mothers whose family members had already been killed or injured, the mothers who had lost partners, who had lost children. I thought about the safety of my own child's room and the peace of our soft rocking chair and the gentle Chopin nocturne that gets to be what she listens to every night. And I thought about the other mothers who knew every night that they nurse their own babies to sleep, that they may not wake up the next morning, whose nighttime music is just bombs. And when I read the news about the ceasefire, when I read it now, I feel the relief in my body that so many of those mothers must feel. An unclenching, maybe, as the fear that their family will be killed by bombs in the night can be let go. That relief and release as the celebrations that are happening in the streets of Gaza are real and they're powerful. And we, amongst many others, have worked and waited so long for them. And yet I cannot release my own grief at the deaths of the more than 46,000 people who died in these 15 months when my baby has grown from a chubby little 4-month-old loaf of bread into a 19-month-old chatty, opinionated, running toddler. I do not feel relief from the fury in my body that so many of those bombs raining down destruction and death were made in my country and paid for by my taxes, delivered across the ocean for a complex game of violence largely meted out against people of color by white people in my name. Those Palestinian mothers are as connected to me as my own baby, and so are the Israelis who died on October 7th. And no one should die by violence in any country at any time. And as a person of conscience and a person who sees the sibling evils of racism and materialism and militarism, I hold the jangling discords of my own interdependence with it all, and my own opposition to both the anti-Semitism and the anti-Islamophobia that have risen up strongly amidst this conflict. And also the clear injustice that 38 Palestinians died for every one Israeli in this conflict. That regardless of the evil initial act by Hamas, my moral conscience must reckon with what was done by my country, not by someone else's, but by my country, to support the Israeli military's bloodshed. Racism, materialism, militarism, three giant triplets as evident today as they were in 1966. Dr. King spoke of his belief that we would be able to transform the clanging discord that so many of us feel when we reflect on the history and the current realities of the United States into a beautiful symphony of siblinghood, that it's possible to bring harmony from profound dissonance. And I know that things were as hard back then, or likely much harder in Dr. King's time than they are in my time. And indeed, Dr. King, even at that time, in that same speech, said that out of a bottomless vitality that his enslaved ancestors continued to grow and develop. He was reflecting on his enslaved ancestors from generations before. He said, if the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop them, the opposition we face now surely will fail. And so today I seek to strengthen my own belief in the possibility of that beautiful symphony of siblinghood by heeding Dr. King's advice that was as true then as it is now, as true now as it was then. And this was his advice. First, Dr. King said that the work of transformation will take a lot of us. It will take protests to bring attention to the problems and to keep them in the public moral mind. It will take boycotts, it will take legislation, it will take working towards actual enforcement of the legislation, it will take action at the ballots and innovation and fundraising and simply being the best people that we can be. It will take all of that. But beyond the external work that we do, Dr. King also always spoke of the soul work as well. We must be grounded in nonviolent philosophy, he said, because through it, a person can use moral means to procure moral ends. In other words, nonviolent philosophy allows us to move away from an ends justify the means way of being. He said, we must keep love at our center regardless of what challenges we face. Quote, the Greek language has 3 words for love, he said. One is the eros, another is the phileo, another is the word agape. And I'm not thinking about eros, he said, which is the more romantic kind of love, or of friendship as expressed in the filio kind of love, but of agape, which is understanding and creative and redemptive goodwill for all people, an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. When one rises to love on this level, he says, he loves a person who does the evil deed while hating the deed. And Dr. King also spoke of what he talks about maladjustment. He said, we must be maladjusted to the oppression in our society. Quote, I never intend to adjust myself to segregation and discrimination, he said. I never intend to become adjusted to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many and give luxuries to the few, and leave millions of people perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of prosperity. I must honestly say, he says, however much criticism it brings, that I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism and to the self-defeating effects of physical violence. We must not accept a status quo of injustice, he said. In her book, Joy Unspeakable, Contemplative Practices in the Black Church, Reverend Dr. Barbara Holmes writes, the activism that ignited the freedom movements, so those movements like the Children's March I spoke of earlier, the freedom movements, that activism had contemplative practices at their center. The very act of passive resistance, of nonviolent resistance, can be described as stillness in the midst of turmoil, she writes. She says, "You cannot face German shepherds and fire hoses with your own resources. There must be a God and stillness at the very center of your being, because otherwise you will spiral into the violence that threatens you." The political era that is beginning tomorrow is designed to make us spiral out. Tomorrow we will inaugurate a president who is known, perhaps more for this than anything else, as someone whose rhetoric is extreme and shocking and designed to invoke a strong emotional reaction, calculated to hook us. From the moment his right hand lifts from the Bible tomorrow, there will be bad news after bad news after bad news for people who share our values. And I expect that each one of us will become hooked at some point. Each one of us will spiral out at some point in the coming days and weeks and months and years. But my friends, when we are on the hook, we are owned by the narrative that corrodes our souls. We are owned by that injustice narrative, and we're just following its lead. And it's our work to build justice, not just to be so constantly depleted by our outrage that we become inert. And so as I look forward to this next political era and this next era for us as a congregation, I believe it is our job to hold our center, hold that stillness, that holiness at the center of our being. And that comes with participating in whatever spiritual practices help us hold our center, whether that's yoga and meditation and Vespers that we do here on Wednesday nights, or worship on Sundays, or whatever personal or communal practices you have, whether they're traditionally called spiritual practices or not. And to hold our centers, we must flood our lives with prophecy and beauty, not just flood our lives with the news. This means turning off the news. I know some of us are talking about turning off social media. It's doing things like listening to kings' speeches, or listening to other leaders and speakers who bring a sense of grounded purpose to your life, who speak to the work of justice in this world. And when we're not just outraged, but also traumatized, it means engaging in practices of beauty to help us survive the trauma. Some of us do that through craft, through arts, through singing. Find a way to practice beauty every day when you are dealing with trauma. My friends, we sang this morning, woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. And the first part of the ceasefire is beginning today. But I know that I must still go to sleep with my mind stayed on freedom amidst the giant triplets of racism and identity-based oppression and poverty and extreme militarism. I must go to sleep with my mind stayed on freedom. I must wake up with my mind stayed on freedom. My friend, may your minds also be stayed on freedom. Hallelujah. May it be so, and amen.
Hi, I'm Reverend Abby Tennis, and I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Reverend Alexandre da Silva Soto, and my pronouns are they, them, and theirs.
And we are the ministers of the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, where it is our mission to awaken love and justice in our lives and in the world. We're so glad you watched this video, and we hope that its message connects with your soul.
We also want to invite you to join us for Zoom services Sunday morning at 11 a.m. or come in person at 2125 Chestnut Street, Center City, Philadelphia.
Whether you join in person or online, in these services you'll hear messages like you just heard. You'll get a chance to sing together, pray together, and even greet one another in coffee hour afterwards, whether you're brand new or a longtime member.
You can always find a Zoom link to our services and more about what to expect on Sunday mornings on our website, philauu.org, philauu.org. The link is below.
If you are connecting with this message and feel moved to give to the mission of this congregation, we invite you to click on the link below again and follow the prompts to give, or send a text message to 215-709-5095, and again, follow the prompts.
If someone in your life needs to hear these words today, please share this video. And again, thank you so much for watching.
We hope to see you soon.
See you soon.